All right, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Wednesday, July 2nd, and I was going to sleep last night listening to Colonel Douglas McGregor, and he was talking about Azerbaijan, and then I just fell asleep. And I
Yeah.
figured I'll just ask you, what's the deal with Azerbaijan? What's up with that
Well,
country?
yeah. Well, what's happened? What's in the news is that they actually detained. They've jailed a certain number of journalists, Russian journalists in Azerbaijan. I think two that are working for RT and one for Ruptly. Um, and they also seized a number of just kind of random Russians, a tourist, someone who was working kind of at IT remotely. Remember back when the SMO was launched, there were a number of young men in particular that just fled Russia. And quite a few of them went to Azerbaijan. In fact, I think your sister knows one of them. He eventually came back, as many did, but some are still there, or maybe were there even previously, because it's an easy country for Russians to visit. And I guess it's cheap, and if you're in IT, you can work remotely. And so it was one of these people too, and then some others. They were just grabbed and clearly beaten up because you see they're just covered with bruises. They were paraded before the cameras, bloodied. So what happened? Well, it seems to be these um, detentions and beatings seem to be in response to an operation conducted by the Russian police in I believe it was Yekaterinburg. I can't remember exactly the name of the city. Okay, um, a group of ethnic Azerbaijanis who were Russian citizens, but apparently, according to the police, according to the authorities there, were basically a criminal organization and had conducted, hits, assassinations of actually other members of the Azerbaijani community there, and were engaged in other criminal activities. And so a number of these people were seized, including the head of an organization. I believe it was called um, the name escapes me right now. But anyway, they were seized, and then two of them died in detention. One of them, the Russians said, from a heart attack. There were two brothers, I think, who were maybe in their 50s or 60s, and then the other from unknown causes. Um, and that's what they seem to be responding to. They seem to think that this was just an unfair targeting of their community. And of course, the Russians say that no, crime is crime, and we conducted this investigation, and the deaths are very regrettable, but they were accidental, and they already sent the bodies back. Apparently, again, it seems like if they were trying to hide something, they wouldn't have done that, but they sent the bodies back quickly, and the Azerbaijani authorities quickly claimed that they had found evidence of, blunt trauma, that they had been beaten to death, but they didn't show any pictures. And I believe that the bodies have already been buried. So it seems to me that that the Russian authorities were telling the truth on this. So this seems to be, it's a very unpleasant situation now, for those Russians, that were recently detained by the authorities in Azerbaijan. They clearly seem to be innocent. They clearly are innocent in my view, and are being used as kind of pawns. Um, Now, if indeed, I don't really have any reason to doubt them. There's always a chance, police corruption exists anywhere, and it certainly exists in Russia. But if indeed this was a criminal organization, then I don't see how the Russians can back down on this. You say, well, we can't just agree not to police, people that are of Azerbaijani ancestry. If they commit crimes, they commit crimes, and we need to arrest them. Um, there's a little bit of a background that may also be contributing to this kind of this lashing out by the Azerbaijani authorities, and that is that Azerbaijan has been supporting the Ukrainians, selling them weapons. And then up until fairly recently, the Russians had not been hitting oil facilities in Ukraine that processed Azerbaijani oil. that Azerbaijan, is an oil producer. We've talked about that earlier. They have a pipeline that goes to Israel that passes through Turkey, and they've been supplying Israel all along, all through, ever since October 7th, and obviously before. Um, and it's been, the speculation is that the Russians had agreed not to attack these facilities, but I think maybe the Azerbaijanis, by continuing to supply weapons to Ukraine, didn't keep their part of the bargain, and then the Russians went after their facilities. So that may have contributed to anger among the Azerbaijani authorities.
Okay, yeah. When I was actually asking that question, I was thinking more of the relationship of Azerbaijan and Israel, and you touched on that a bit, but it also has an interesting relationship with Ukraine and Russia.
Sure.
Is the way that you're describing it makes it sound like Azerbaijan is very heavily influenced by the West, the United States. If they're supporting essentially our two proxies, Israel and Ukraine, is that true?
Well,
Are they
yeah.
themselves a pawn in this?
I don't think so. I think probably if you want to, that as Azerbaijan, I think is very similar to Turkey, or the Aliyev, I believe, is the president there in Azerbaijan. He's very similar to Erdogan in Turkey, and that he plays his own game, and um, he works with both sides. Let's say in the larger geopolitical context. So, of course, Erdogan is a member of NATO, and but then he also actually has, very extensive trade relations and other relations with Russia. And then, well, he actually trades with Israel, and, and has allows the oil to pass through his country to Israel, but he also denounces Israel. And I think you find something similar within Azerbaijan. I mean, Azerbaijan actually has decent relations with Iran, and up until very recently with Russia, but also with Turkey and with the West. And so it's been one of these countries that has kind of taken advantage of being, valuable to both sides and playing both sides off against each other. And then you mentioned Israel. Yes, they've actually had very close relations with Israel, and it appears in this recent war that Israel launched against Iran that quite a few of the attacks, especially the drone attacks, were launched from within Azerbaijan.
What does Azerbaijan have to say about that? Is it
They,
something
they,
that
yeah, this is not something I think that they talk about publicly. It's just, people have noticed this for quite a while.
Yeah, it's I don't know hardly anything about this country, but it's a very interesting country that's just sort of in the middle of all these conflicts. And is that a smart move by Azerbaijan to be playing? Also, I mean, you're looking at the best interests of your country. I mean, is it just play both sides,
Well,
I mean, it
you
doesn't
have to
sound like
say,
they're taking a neutral stance. It's they're getting
right,
involved to some extent.
right. Yeah, I mean, it's a dangerous game. You have to say Erdogan has played it skillfully, all in all, and I think it has been certainly to his benefit, and possibly to the benefit of Turkey as a whole. But it's a dangerous game, That's and like for example, this recent lashing out again by Azerbaijan against Russia. I don't know what kind of response that's going to get from Russia. That's I don't think this is something that Russia can accept, but I don't know exactly what Russia will do. Now, Russia is important to Azerbaijan, but Azerbaijan is also important to Russia. It is, for example, it does border Iran and is a potential part of this kind of north-south corridor. And I think that was the intention. But I mean, if you have such an unstable government there, I think that the Russians maybe, I believe they had plans to actually lay the, pipelines between Iran and Russia through Azerbaijan, but they may be reconsidering that.
Hmm. It seems like that's a good deal to have because then you just get transit fees. You don't have to do anything, but you get
Yeah,
money just for all the gas that
right.
passes through.
Yeah, no, it is a great deal, and it's like it was a great deal for Ukraine. It's amazing the Russians were paying Ukraine all the way up until the end of last year for the oil that passed through the Friendship pipeline, and then Yeah, incredibly, the Ukrainians just shot themselves in the foot and cut it off, deprived themselves of, I believe it was $700 million a year. And also, I think, well, let's see, it was a gas pipeline. Sorry, I think the Jews was a gas pipe. $700 million a year, and plus some of that gas, they actually did draw some from that pipeline for their own needs, but now they've deprived themselves of that.
And someone needs to put a gas pipeline through my property. Let me get some of those fees. So do you see Azerbaijan becoming a bigger player in both of these conflicts between Israel and Iran and Ukraine, Russia?
Well, yeah, potentially. It's not because of its geographical location. It borders Turkey, it borders Iran. Of course, it's been in conflict with Armenia. And then it's also an oil producer. Those make it an important country.
There's so many things to learn and figure out
Yeah,
what's going on.
I don't know a whole lot about this country. I'll just be honest with you about Azerbaijan.
Okay. Well, I'll switch over and ask you a different question. I was just thinking about the U.S. Operation Midnight Hammer, where we hit these three bases, these nuclear Natanz, Isfahan, and Fordo. Militarily speaking, do you think this operation makes the United States look stronger?
I think all in all it does. I mean, the fact that the B-2 bombers got in there, that they didn't lose a single one of them, and they were able to, drop their payloads was, I think you have to say, is a success. Now, there's some question about, I don't think the Iranians actually cooperated and allowed this to happen, but it's a possibility, and there is that question mark, and so that takes some of the glory away from this, this operation, or but, and then there's also just we know that the Iranian air defense network was degraded, so it may be that they really weren't up against much. Now, these bombs, the thing is, we see big holes in the ground and that they look impressive from the sky, but we just don't know what they've done. That's the thing, is they're bunker busters. They go deep into the ground and then explode, and we just don't know what kind of damage that they've done. I don't think anybody knows. The Iranians will know first. I think they're in the process of digging down there, and they'll find out, but nobody really knows. So as far as the effectiveness of those bombs goes, it's very much an open question. But I think probably all in all, it certainly didn't hurt the reputation of the U.S. You can't say that it was a failure. I don't think it was the resounding success that Trump pretends that it was, but it wasn't a failure.
Yeah, my initial thought was that as well. Like, okay, it does show that the U.S. has some, these B-2 stealth bombers did a long journey, carried these large bombs, and they came out unscathed. It made it seem like they ruled the skies. And we don't know if there's some coordination where they told Iran, look, don't fire at these planes. Maybe there was something like this, because it doesn't seem like they were under fire at all. Or maybe that the tech was that good. But then I was just thinking about it more, and I was just thinking, how many of these GBU 57 bunker buster bombs did they use? Was it 14, 12?
Right. Well, it's funny. They say, 14, 12 on the Fordo facility, and then 2 on Natanz, if I understand correctly. Now, I was looking at the satellite photos and actually analysis by Theodore Postal of it. There's some very clear photos of the damage done at Fordo, from above. We don't know what kind of damage was done underground. And you can see 6 holes. So I don't know where the other 6 are. Maybe they are somewhere. But so if indeed they dropped 14 bombs, according to the best information that I can find, they had a total of 20 of these bombs. So they only have 6. Now, I think they can start producing, and they can, but it'll take some months to actually replace the bombs that were used.
Right. So that's what I wanted to get to, is that I heard that as well, that we dropped 14 of these and we only had 20. So it's like you did this huge campaign, and it's unclear if we actually really achieved something. We say we won and declared victory, but that's it. We don't even have the bombs to do it again if we wanted to. And then I think that actually has the opposite effect, right? If you're looking at this longer analytically and be like, okay, did they achieve their goals? No. They used up what 70% of their munitions or something like this in one go. And so the idea of being able to, if they were engaged in a war of attrition, then they know that the United States is in big trouble. And we're hearing more and more reports as well of like, I think Pete Hegseth said something about we're going to slow down or stop sending arms to Ukraine because our own stockpiles are dangerously low. So just these open admissions that, the U.S. military can't keep up just via proxy wars. If we were getting involved directly in a real war, then we're in major trouble. So that's the what I took away from this, or what I'm taking away now.
Yeah. I think probably the average person doesn't think that much about it. It's again, the U.S. military, Western militaries in general, are kind of geared for these you could call them, short-term operations. Right, but they are not geared for wars of attrition. We know that. And again, that statement from Pete Hegseth is just a reminder of that. We are running out of everything. And, that's the reason why he said, I guess there's no more interceptors, no more F-16 fired missiles, and no more high precision artillery shells. Now, that just tells you that what we've known really is that they're running out of all kinds of things. And now those are things, with the exception of the artillery shells, those are things that Israel needs, the interceptors and the air to ground missiles.
Mm. Do you think that most Americans think that this war it's over, that between Iran and Israel, that most people like it's out of the news for them because we're in our own bubble and we're talking about it all the time. And
I think so. I think that's what most people think. It's and even in like the Israeli news, it's generally described, with some exceptions, as a great victory, and that we basically just you could say neutered Iran. They're no longer a threat, and we achieved our objectives. That's the way it's being portrayed within the Israeli media. And I'm not talking about like the ultra nationalist media, but again with the left wing media, that's generally very much more willing to be critical of the IDF, but they're not at all critical of the IDF in this case. So there's a general perception, that Israel won, and that basically the so-called Iran threat has been neutralized, and it's over, for the foreseeable future. That their program at least has been delayed by years, and that's the that seems to be the mainstream narrative that is probably believed by the great majority of people in the West.
Right. Yeah, Trump definitely, for good reason, wants to get all this news out of the way. It doesn't look good, but it's impossible with Israel doing what it's doing in Gaza. It's going to keep on bringing this problem to the forefront. And I know Trump is trying really hard. Well, I don't know how. He's not trying really hard. He could just stop it if he just tells Israel no more weapons. But we're having... it's crazy. We're having basically a massacre every single day. It's just becoming normalized. And it's just these, I was just thinking earlier today, because I don't know why it popped in my mind, but I thought of the Boston massacre here in the United States at the beginning of the Revolutionary War, and how that hardened everybody against the British, and really kind of helped swing things over the favor of the independence movement in the United States. 5 people were killed by the British during that massacre, and it caused their blood to boil. And then here, it's just every day, 100 people, 50 of them kids, just while they're lining up to get food. It's just happening every day, day of day. Right. You think like what happened in Boston back in the day for us was enough to get that revolutionary spirit going. Right. Think about what this is doing, for the people around the world, getting this revolutionary spirit that this has to stop. But it keeps on going on, and it seems like Trump just can't have it, can't tell Netanyahu to stop. But he's pushing some plan for a 60-day ceasefire that Israel's totally on board with. And he's saying Hamas has to take this deal. Can you tell us what that deal is? Something they should take?
I don't know the details of it. Yeah, the last I heard is that Israel had agreed to it, and then it was the ball was in Hamas's court. But at the same time, I've heard that, well, yeah, the IDF is in favor of this, but Netanyahu isn't. He really doesn't want a ceasefire. He wants to go ahead with the operations and the ethnic cleansing. Um, so, beyond that, it seems like more of the same. We've heard these things before. We hear these very optimistic statements from Trump. Usually, nothing comes of those statements. So I don't know. We could have a ceasefire. I mean, again, Hamas is in a really a desperate situation, and the Gazan people are, and they just may agree to one. And there is pressure within Israel, that continues, and a majority of Israelis really do want to see a ceasefire and want the hostages to come home. It's Netanyahu and his, far right coalition members that just want to continue. So we'll see. There could be a ceasefire, um, but again, I wouldn't bet on it. Again, it just may be that, well, Hamas, for its own reasons, it understands that this is a ceasefire that will be um, violated by the Israelis. They saw what happened in the last one. They need to have some kind of guarantee. I don't know, how they can get it. Because the thing is that if they return all the hostages, the last of them, and I think they maybe have like from 25, something like that, or living hostages, then they don't have any bargaining chips left. Those are their bargaining chips. And so they need to get some sort of real, solid guarantee that the ceasefire will lead to actual peace and be supported by the U.S. But again, how can they actually get a guarantee that they can believe in? I don't know. So that's on, Hamas's side. And then again, we have these people on the Israeli side who really don't want to see a ceasefire. They just see it as an interruption of their ethnic cleansing campaign. But they may have to, but there's a lot of pressure within Israel, both from the IDF and then from the general population, to make some kind of deal.
Yeah, I mean, I know Hamas doesn't have really any cards to play, but just seeing what happened in Iran during these negotiations and the sneak attack, and then also just the first ceasefire originally with Gaza and Israel as well, how it was broken. It just seems like Hamas has to know that any agreement that they make with Israel and the United States is ultimately going to be a trap of some sort, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the history. And it's just every ceasefire that it seems that Israel has ever agreed to is subsequently violated by them, often on a massive scale. Certainly true in Lebanon that the violations are ongoing, and it was true of the last Gaza ceasefire. The Israelis just didn't um, abide by it, and they slowed down their operations. They didn't kill nearly as much, but they hardly they didn't deliver on their promises, or very very few of them.
Do we see any glimmers of hope for the people of Gaza, the Palestinians? I mean, just there seems to be increasing awareness and the public speaking
Yeah,
out against it.
right.
Is there any?
Yeah, I really don't think so. I'm just sorry to say that. I just don't see hope. They have been. Gaza was a very densely populated place to begin with. By some measures, it was the most densely populated territory. However you want to define that in the world, and they have been they have been driven from approximately 80% of their land, or 82% now of Gaza is a militarized zone. With places in those militarized zones, the Gazan citizens are not supposed to. They're simply not supposed to enter those zones. So 18% of Gaza is still technically safe. And what we've learned from the past is so-called safe zones aren't really safe. Tent cities get bombed and so forth. So they've been squeezed into an ever-shrinking uh, piece of land, and they're being starved. Their food's coming, but it's just so um, sparse, and it's really so far below, what they really need, that malnutrition is rampant. People are dying. I don't. We really just don't know how many people are dying. We get some sense of how many people are killed directly by the IDF, but we don't know how many people are dying just because of the lack of medical facilities and because of malnutrition and so on and so forth. There was, I know this is just an anecdote, but I think it does illustrate, the kind of situation that they're in and how many people do end up dying in Gaza. I was just reading about a man who was spent, days down in southern Gaza trying to get some food at one of these food distribution centers, that's run by this private foundation, clearly controlled by Israel, probably funded by the Mossad. And he never actually got the food, but he ended up being shot, on his last attempt, and he got a bullet in his buttocks, and he was able to return home. But then as the days, the next day or the day after, he began to show signs of some sort of infection. He began to, well, actually, I skipped a very important part of it. I mean, first he went to a hospital, and they told him, "Sorry, we can't help you." And basically, the reason is if your leg hasn't been blown off or your arm hasn't been blown off, you're just we don't have the time for you, because they have to just, they have to focus their resources on those people who are in the greatest need, and they just don't have the resources to treat every injury. So he went home, and then, he began to develop these symptoms, went back, and they said, okay, we'll operate. But they didn't have the proper equipment. For example, they didn't have CAT scan machines, or they only had one for the whole hospital, and that was just reserved again for the high priority cases. So they didn't even really know exactly where the bullet was, and they just didn't have all the necessary equipment to perform the surgery properly. Normally, this would have been an easy surgery to perform. It would have been with a very high rate of success. But, okay, they did get the bullet out of him, but then he died like 2 days later. And this is, okay, his brother is telling the story, and he said, and then back at home, their father is getting sicker and sicker. He has a heart condition, but he no longer can get heart medicine. And he's going to, so, they're worried about him. They may lose him too. And that's just take that one. This is a story of one man talking about his brother and about his father, but just multiply that by, 1 million. And I mean, really by 1 million. And that's what's happening in Gaza. So a lot of things, there are those people that are gunned down and killed, immediately by the Israelis. And we get most of those statistics, but not nearly all of them, because again, people end up under the rubble, or they're vaporized, or they just, there's nobody to report the incident. Just so the family is already, maybe the parents have been killed and it's just some kids, and they don't know to go to the hospital and report it. So there are various reasons why we don't get even the full figure for, for the direct deaths by the IDF. But this other one just gives you a kind of an idea of how many secondary or indirect deaths there are, from the war. And that's a huge part of what their suffering entails. And it's ongoing, and it's getting worse, with every passing day.
Yeah, this at some point in time, the Western world will have to recognize what has happened in Gaza, right? At some point, they will.
I hope so. Like we said, there are glimmers of recognition. I think in some cases they're sincere. I think it is at least partially sincere, for example, in the case of Piers Morgan. But these statements that come from Mertz, I just don't think these people really care. They just understood that they need to say something because Israel's making them look bad. But they continue to support Israel, really without conditions. Nothing's changed on that point. Like you say, I would think so. It's just that we've gone so far already, and nothing has really changed, that it just makes me wonder, maybe the Israelis can go all the way and still nothing will change. I mean, before this began, I didn't think that, that could be possible, but I didn't think it was possible that we could go so far and we can still have solid support from Western governments.
Right. I think it's it's disgusting and shocking to so much of the world to see how the Western governments have been so complicit in this. And then, part of me wonders, like, okay, is it because Mossad's got dirt on everybody or they feel threatened? Or is part of it actually just self-preservation, that they weren't really paying attention so much in the beginning? We'll just do whatever the United States says. We always say Israel's great, blah, blah, blah. And now it's gotten to this point where like, uh-oh, wait, what, forced starvation? I don't like that. I can't ignore it. But as a political leader of the West during this time, you will be going down in history as one of these evil men that did not stand up to this genocide. And so you're like, uh-oh, I can't be complicit in this. The only way forward is if we stop now, then my crimes will be exposed. So maybe we have to be victorious on this and we have to put more support behind Israel. I'm just trying to think, rationalize
Yeah.
how these guys can justify what's going
Yeah.
on.
Well, yeah, I don't think these people have any kind of moral compass whatsoever. I'm unfortunately, most of these people that rise to the top in Western countries, that they're just kind of, again, I describe them as empty suits, just tools of the various deep states, or they just know what they're supposed to do, and that's what they do. That's what brought them to the top. They never really exercise their conscience, and I think their consciences maybe don't really exist. They just they worry when they begin to look bad, though. And so, but their response is not to actually change course, but, to wring their hands in public a little bit. And they think that'll be a solution to the problem. I just have, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, these leaders, they're narcissistic, right? I mean, they care about their legacy. They want to be on the right side of history, right? Surely there's got to be a point where they have to realize that, okay, I'm going to be on the wrong side of of history on this. And I guess the calculation that some might make is that, all right, I'll stay. Right, we can turn this road ship around if we just wipe out all the Palestinians and then we don't ever talk about it again, and it'll just be the history's written by the victors. Maybe there's
Yeah.
something in that, but
Yeah.
surely we got to have more and more people think like, uh-oh, history's not going to look kindly upon the people that were complicit in this, supported it, had some power to speak out against it, and didn't do it.
Yeah. Well, it's possible. Maybe if it becomes very clear, and the public pressure continues to grow, at some point, these people, for self-interested reasons, will flip in a meaningful way. That's certainly possible. It seems like a lot of them, when you talk about history, is for them, their history is they're always living in 1939, right? And to to show that you're a moral person, you have to stand on side of the victims, who are the Jews. And now, yeah, okay, they were victims back in 1939, but they're not the victims now. It's just that you say, okay, you're very brave in your 1939 world, but in the world that exists now, you're on the wrong side. It just seems like they haven't woken up. Their morality is based on events that took place a long time ago, and a certain interpretation of those events, but it's not based on the current reality, and that's not uh, and so it has caused them to actually, as you say, put themselves on the wrong side of history as it is being lived out before our eyes now.
Right. Yeah, everybody invoking World War II and doing these Hitler and Winston Churchill comparisons constantly. The recent events have kind of ruined World War II for me. You know how I was, as a little kid, I was obsessed with World War II. I think you remember all these books I have, and and now it's just, World War II has been tainted. This great story, the good fight, the narrative that was always put about the bad guys, and how we stopped, Hitler. The whole history of the West. And I think this is kind of what I'm getting at a bit, is that I think what we're doing in our complicity in Gaza, I think is destroying everything about the Western world. Is that maybe
Yeah, well, I think it's
hyperbolic? I mean,
I think it is. I mean, I think it really is eating away at the foundations. And again, you can see it more in the younger generation. Like in my generation, I wasn't part of, obviously part of the generation that went and fought the war, but I grew up in the shadow of it, and it did certainly shape my view of the world, and it shaped everybody's view of the world. It was the defining event of the 20th century, and so people's sense of morality and of who the victims are and all that was really kind of um, was was determined, by the the story, of World War II. And now, we are. It's that was 80 years ago, and we have, the most recent generations are have grown up. They're no longer in that shadow. They do hear about it, but it's distant. And what they're more aware of, especially like people in their 20s now, is what's happening in Gaza now. And that's the reality that's actually defining their sense of the world and let's say geopolitical morality. So it is. I think it really is changing, and it is bringing about the end um, of that kind of very unusual set of circumstances that that create people with the thinking of Keir Starmer and Mertz and Trump for that matter. They're products of the World War II generation. Even though they again like me, they grew up in its shadow, and it, that's just going to be 10, 20 years from now. I don't think you're going to find leaders like that anymore. And there is a real chance that that whole legacy that has been terribly abused. I mean, it was a real war, and I think the story that we're told about it is largely true. I think it can be embellished, and it's simplified. It wasn't quite so black and white. It was more shades of gray, but all in all, it was a good fight, and I in general agree with it. But it's that story of World War II was ended up being abused, and I think people now are seeing it, and like you, they're kind of developing just almost a revulsion towards it. I don't want to hear about it anymore. You're just using it to do terrible things now.
Right. So, I mean, if this story is so much part of our identity, our history, and of us, of our sense of morality, like you're saying, us being the good guys, the good fight, what's going to happen to the Western world when we realize that we are on the wrong side of history, that we're not the good guys? What happens? Because this isn't. It's different than just like a World War II, World War One, because you had an actual military defeat, you had millions of people dead, but we're seeing something different. We're seeing
Yeah.
the death of Western society via a proxy without actual direct conflict of Western
Hmm.
European nations and, the United States, Canada.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to say, because the thing is, um, it is that third pillar that we talk about, the soft power. It's not just important for the way the rest of the world looks at the West, but it's important within the West. The sense of we being on the right side of history, it kind of gives legitimacy to our own governments. And if that's really eaten away and then finally collapses, then that I think that tells you that the old order, the other two pillars, the economic and the military, really can't. They've been weakened too, But even without that, the legitimacy provided by the World War II narrative, um, the whole system, the Western system is really put in jeopardy. It's stripped of legitimacy, and all I can say is that I think it's going to, without pretending to know what it's going to lead to, it's going to open up Pandora's box because it's just, again, I tend to think back to China. It's like when the Qing dynasty fell, there was nothing really to replace it. So we had this period of warlords and various kinds of movements, and nothing really worked until, well, the communists were victorious, and then we don't have to go too far down that road. But it's just that I think we're in a. I know things are very, very different, but it's sort of broadly similar. It's just that there is this crisis of legitimacy, and that just opens the door to all kinds of possibilities and just all sorts of different people. They can be political entrepreneurs, of various stripes, take advantage of of the vacuum, and different ideologies arise, and we'll see where we're going. Maybe we see it like a one sort of precursor of this with the election of what's his name,
Hmm?
Rama
Oh, Zoran Mandami, I
Zoran.
think.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So, okay. I remember his
something
first
like
name.
that.
I'm terrible with names. Forgive me. Yeah, but his election is an outright socialist. This is, and he's talking about real socialist measures. And that wasn't possible in the U.S. For the last century. That's something like that. There was a real socialist movement back in the very early part of the 20th century that did have a real following, but we haven't seen anything like that again. I think it's because this lack of legitimacy is just like, okay, there was sort of this this habit of just basically supporting the establishment. We have a system that works. Maybe we want to tinker with it at the edges. So I'm going to vote Democrat or I'm going to vote Republican, whatever. But neither side is going to make any sort of drastic change. And, you still see that in Europe. It's just like even as places like Germany start to fall apart, you still have the majority of people just think they can't conceive of voting for, somebody who's really outside of the system. But I think we're going to see more and more things that similar to what we've seen in New York City, where people actually will go outside the system. We've already seen, in some ways, he's not really outside of the system, but he's got a foot, he does outside of it, one foot in it, he is not truly the establishment's favorite candidate, but he's clearly being, I think, controlled. And in the end, the establishment has learned to work with him and to kind of contain him. But we're going to see more and more candidates like this, and we're going to see political movements that really challenge the whole system, that are not just making, adjustments at the edges.
Right. Yeah, I think it's interesting because we have, Zoran on the left, the socialist side, and then we have Thomas Massey kind of the counterweight to that as well. I think both of these are kind of rejections of normal political parties, and also both of them reject the Israelis' lobby influence in the United States. They're not Israeli firsters. That's a defining pillar, I think, of their platform. So both of them are getting a lot of support. I know, was it Elon Musk is throwing his weight behind Thomas Massey because, Trump is after Thomas Massey. He saw that tweet.
Yeah.
He's a very bad guy. I mean, say what you want about Thomas Massey. He's not a bad guy.
Yeah.
And
he's
very
APAC
principled.
is after him too. They've
Right.
put the, right.
Well, I imagine
targeted
APAC
him.
sent, well, I guess Trump is mad about the big, beautiful bill, but probably also
Right.
getting pressure from APAC.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, so it's an interesting time. We'll see politically, I think throughout the West, I believe you're right. We're going to see some chaos, some strange ideas, and like I said, political entrepreneurs, people will rise up and spout their ideas, and maybe that's what we need. I'm sure there'll be a lot of failed experiments, but hopefully we can find something that works well, and understand like what we did, learn from all of our mistakes here in the past. But yeah, I sometimes I think it's normal for people always to think that they're living through some pivotal time. And there's always wants to have some type of self-importance. But I think that what we're living through now, it truly, truly is. It's not something that we just think it is, because
Yeah.
it's something I think you told me at the very beginning when we started these conversations was how Western dominance has been around for 500 years. 500 years of sort of Western civilization leading the charge. But now it has fundamentally changed. Can you kind of explain and expound on that, just sort of the gravity of what it is that we're living through?
Yeah. Okay. I think that's true. It's just the main challenge is you have to say, well, Russia, China, and the global South. You could put it in those terms. And first of all, just looking at Russia briefly, it's just Russia has been, I guess it's since like the end or the beginning of the 18th century, basically. So even the late 17th under Peter the Great. So we're going back, not quite 500 years. but 400 years, 350 years, let's just say something like that. That Russia has been really obsessed with the West and has been oriented towards the West, has seen its future as being with the West. Um, and even the Soviet period, they obviously there was the Iron Curtain, but the Warsaw Pact was part of the West, and that was part of the Soviet alliance. And Marxism, Leninism is something that came from the West too. So even that, even though it was, there was this the Cold War, there still was that fundamentally a Western orientation. But that is just over. It's because of the sanctions and the hostility that was obviously preceded the SMO, but just accelerated after the SMO. Russia has turned east, and it looks like they have really given up on the West. It's not like they're just hoping that this is a temporary spat and they can back. That's what Putin's saying. It's just, look, guys, it's over. It's just like this is going to be for decades. So they're looking east. They're looking to China and India. So this is, again, one of the great powers of the world has turned away from the West. And I think that's geopolitically, that's an event of tremendous significance. It's a huge geopolitical earthquake. And, we haven't seen anything like that again for centuries. And then China, is, I think above all, is just the fact that China is become the world's greatest manufacturing power. And then I think in terms of purchasing power parity, is the largest economy in the world. Its economic significance is huge, and it really is the largest economy, and has surpassed the U.S. Now, when China went on this path of economic development, beginning with Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s, there was a real hope, and that and a belief, I think, a confidence. I think it was part of Western smugness that they're just going to become like us. So this is what we need to just, we will encourage trade and whatever, and over time, they'll just be integrated in the system, and they'll just be part of of our, of the Western system, essentially. But that's not what's happened. It's that China, though has taken advantage of the trade opportunities and is doing very well as a part of the international, economic system. It has stuck to its own political path, and so again, this is something of huge geopolitical consequence. So, you have this enormous economic power, and because it's such a great economic and technological power, it is therefore a great military power. And they are not part of the Western camp. And in fact, they are beginning, it seems like with every passing year, they increase their lead in economic terms and probably in military terms as well. So this is right there, you see the beginning of the end of Western dominance. And then there's just what is the global South, and I'll just include India and Indonesia and, Africa and the rest of Asia. They're all part of that. And most of those countries were really looked to the West, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union. That's where you say, okay, that's the center of power. We need to cooperate with these people. We need to align ourselves with them. But now that the facts have changed, they see what's happened with Russia, and they've seen what's happened with China. They understand that they live in a new world. And so they are not necessarily just abandoning the West and, becoming firm allies of China and or Russia, but they have completely changed their orientations where, they say, okay, well, we'll cooperate with the West where we can. But it's important to be working with these people. And so they're no longer these firm allies, but they're neutral countries, or maybe like Azerbaijan or something. They're playing two sides, the two sides against each other. So it's a very different landscape, geopolitical landscape now that we have. And the West still insists on having this hegemony, but you can see that they really, to a great extent, have lost it already. And the trends are for, increasing diminution of Western hegemonic power.
Yeah,
when we talk about this Western dominance for 500 years, this is, would you say that that's truly an anomaly where there was sort of some type of global hegemon where a Western power in some shape or form, whether it's the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, French, British, and finally the Americans, that sort of engage in this type of imperialism and this type of, attempt for global hegemony. Um, that in itself is just an anomaly. Prior to that, there wasn't really the technological capacity for anything like this, right?
Right.
So what the Western world, everything we know about the Western world the past 500 years that's really shaped us is kind of falling apart, right? Like this has
Yeah.
been so much part of the of Western identity, and now it's over. But maybe we can go back to being normal again. But I
Right.
wonder if we can, because I mean, 500 years of this type of history is it kind of difficult? I'm just
Yeah.
wondering, like,
Well, it does
I,
seem to be difficult. That's it. And clearly, the elites in these countries just clearly are having trouble, abandoning this mindset. It seems to be it's hard for them to look at the world in any other way. It seems clear to me. Um, some maybe some people understand that okay, the economics have changed and we need to adjust accordingly, but they still have this at least a sense of moral superiority. Um, and they're very reluctant to give it up. It just seems to me that it's become who they are. And I think it's just going to take a new generation that maybe really does understand and has grown up in this new world and understands that we do live in this new world and we have to act accordingly. That new generation has to replace them. I just you just don't see any signs from the leadership in the West that they get or they're even able to recognize the new reality.
I think what was surprising to me was to see that this type of thinking truly existed because the language that the Western world always used was that kind of like we are in a multipolar world. Look at all the diversity we have around the world and all these independent countries.
Right.
And you look at a map, you don't see the United States encroaching on people's territories. You just see the globe like everybody's happy here. And then you start to learn about, oh, okay, it's a little bit more nefarious. This, international rules based order and all these different NGOs and color revolutions and NATO and all these organizations for imperial control. It's the
Right.
same thing, but we just did it in a sneakier way, more or less.
Yeah. No, it's not like it's true. It's not like empires in the past that were really about direct territorial control. But yeah, we have at least 800 military bases around the world, and then more importantly, probably these NGOs and just various means of keeping countries in line. And these countries, over the years, have learned that okay, you just have to do what the U.S. says, and they have been losing their independence. And then those countries that resist, like Iran, learn the hard way that yeah, it isn't such a happy multipolar war. It's sort of like you're allowed to have your. It's sort of you find like multiculturalism within the West too. It's just that okay, yeah, it's wonderful if they wear different clothes and they eat different foods or whatever, but they basically have to bow down to our ideology and our fundamental interests. And yeah, that seems to be the deal. And then for any country like Iran that says no, no, we're just going our own way, then they find out, oh, um, yeah, it's really isn't about diversity. It's it's about hegemony. And the Chinese and so many other countries, obviously the Russians have all found this out and really understand this now. I think maybe all of them were kind of, maybe to some extent, were um, bought into the rhetoric that that described, but they found out that that's just rhetoric. If you don't toe the line, you will suffer. It becomes in real ways, very very real ways.
Yeah, no, it's amazing just how much effort we put into it. All these countries, all these NGOs, how many people are working on trying to maintain U.S. primacy, global hegemony. I mean, has to be an incredibly expensive task. But this type of imperialism it's not the same as when we look back what the British did or anything like this, the Dutch, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there was a lot of trade, controlling routes. We're not even extracting resources. We're just spending so much money to try to what make people like us, to overthrow governments that, which it just has the opposite intended effect. This is what's so strange about the United States form of imperialism. It's almost like it's imperialism that doesn't serve the empire. It doesn't. It's not. It's not making the empire richer. I mean, the whole point of having an empire, right, is so that you can extract resources from
Yeah.
all over the globe.
Right. Yeah. No, I know a lot of people on the left will argue that because that's, the traditional leftist understanding of Western hegemony. And it was true to a great extent of earlier colonial systems. But I agree, with few exceptions, this is actually not to our benefit, but to our detriment. I guess you can say that sometimes it's to the benefit of people in the elite, or corporations that get certain contracts or whatever. But that when you look at our overall economy, no, it is weakened us. It is the money is flowing out to support these various efforts and mechanisms of control. And it would be a good thing for us. Again, as we've said, we don't hate America. We want actually America to become a normal country and to give up the stream of global hegemony. And I think America can prosper if that's what we do. It'll do much better than it's doing right now.
Yeah, the empire is bankrupting us. Did the previous empires, did they bankrupt themselves? Or did they see a lot of prosperity initially? I imagine, right? I mean, like with the British and India and all this, I mean, it's got to be very beneficial.
Well, yeah, actually, I'll just be honest. It's been a while since I've read those histories, so I couldn't give you a figure. I think in the end, it's just like it's similar to like what happened, for example, in the South. You say that slavery in the end was actually not a very efficient economic institution. And I know there's a great deal of controversy over that, but my understanding that it really wasn't, and it wasn't even really to the benefit of the South in the long run. But so I would just kind of analogize that to other forms of control. I think it really is about control, more than anything. Yeah, sometimes there are economic benefits. I think clearly there are, but a country that just freely engages in trade actually minimizes its own costs, and free trade is that's conducted to the benefit of both parties enriches both sides. I think that's really true. I guess I'm with the free market people on that. So these systems, yeah, I think you can probably point to their times when, they really did extract, but it's an expensive way to extract resources. Let's say free trade is actually a much more efficient and less costly way of doing that, and to do it without violence and in a way that actually benefits both parties. So I think it's a mistake. It's just like, people have said that, well, the Iraq War was about oil, and maybe to some extent it was. But it was hugely expensive, conquering this country, and it cost a great deal in both blood and treasure. And yes, we got some of our oil companies, maybe got some contracts or whatever, but it would have been so much easier in the end, so much more cost effective, simply to trade with them.
Yeah, for sure. With the U.S., we weren't started out as a nation with an imperialist mindset. It's a rather recent phenomenon, but it's the only, America that I know today. Well, when did it become all about U.S. primacy and global hegemony?
Right. Well, I think it really was following the Civil War, and especially in the early
The
20th
Civil War?
century. Yeah, following the Civil War
That we started caring about primacy? That
Yeah,
long
well,
ago?
okay, well, you had the first real, let's say, in, imperialist. Teddy Roosevelt, I think is. So this is a few decades after the Civil War, but around the turn of the century, with Teddy Roosevelt, and we seized the Philippines and Cuba and so on. It was the beginning that we started to play the imperial game and to gain our own possessions. That was. But I think it did grow out of the Union victory in the Civil War. We began to see ourselves not as not in the traditional way as, a republic. We began to develop an imperial mindset. And it took concrete form under Teddy Roosevelt. But that was, a stint, again, it was limited and there was opposition to it. I believe it was even Mark Twain that was part of the Anti-Imperial League. There were many intellectuals that opposed it. And and then, of course, there was our expansion of our own territory, seizing territory from the Indian tribes. That was a kind of imperialism. But it really, was when we began to see that, to look at the whole globe as, as the whole globe as a potential, let's say, colony of the United States. That began after World War II. That was a post-World War II legacy because, of course, the British really had been retired from that. One of the important outcomes of that war is that, we demonstrated our power, and the British were clearly, a power inferior to us. And we kind of began to fill the British shoes and, establish bases around the world, and then began to see with the beginning of the Cold War that we were the ones that had to, defend the free world and make the world safe for democracy and that kind of thing.
Is there any way to wind down global hegemony peacefully?
Well, yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, there is. You really can. I guess, the fear is, and I think maybe some of these people really have this fear, is like if we pull out, then chaos will ensue. It's just like we're the ones that are kind of keeping the peace, just like the Romans had their Pax Romana. There's a Pax Americana, the American peace, because now we've shown that that's just not true. So many of the wars that have because of, American imperial invasions. So it just isn't true. But you could say in some cases, like if we do pull out of certain regions, wars could ensue. It's not, it's not like that is some sort of age of peace that will necessarily ensue. But, we have to do it for our own sake. And then you have to look at the policy in general has just had horrific consequences. I don't think we have to idealize the multipolar world to understand that this hegemonic world needs to end before it really leads to the destruction of the planet.
Okay, well, let's end it there then.
Okay.
It's a good heavy note. All right. Have a good rest of your dad. Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.